Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today is finally the time for the first of my year of Sanderson discussion videos. I don't know what to call them yet. Basically what I'm doing this year is, together with two friends, Steph from Coffee Over Apples and Scylla from Scylla's Pocats, I am this year rereading the Stormlight Archive series, and we're taking about 2 months, maybe a bit more than 2 months, to read each book. And so we are doing those rereads to prepare for the publication of book 5 in the Stormlight Archive, obviously, which is the last Brandon Sanderson book that I ever intend to read. And important info, all of us don't really like Brandon Sanderson, so the reason why we're doing this reread is to be critical. Sometimes overcritical, sometimes just enough. And at the end of each book we're also doing a live show. The live show for book 1 already is up. I will leave the link down below, and I believe we'll have the live show for book 2 on the 5th of May, which will be over on Scylla's channel. Anyway, I personally, additionally to those live shows, decided that after each book I want to upload a discussion video to different topics. I have the topics right now of Sanderson and his world building, which will be this video, then gender in the Stormlight Archive, Sanderson and colonialism, and then also why Kaladin is actually a terrible character, even though he is still the only reason that I can somewhat get through these books, because Kaladin still is my favorite character in the series. So those will be the 4 videos that I upload, and today it's Sanderson's Worldbuilding, which, I will not lie, this video will be very rambly. I wanted to film this video based on notes, which I don't usually do, but then I realized after dragging this with me for like 2 months now almost already, that if I wait until I have time to sit down and jot down notes, I will never film this video. So this will be a very rambly, all over the place video. I hope you don't mind. Anyway, before I get into it, little disclaimer that I want to have out of the way. World building is something that is very subjective. I personally am also overly critical when it comes to Sanderson's world building, because I have read some of his stuff on world building and especially on magic systems, and I do not like his opinions, and I think he is often, even though he says he has learned to appreciate it or whatever, he's often very dismissive of soft magic systems or any type of world building that doesn't fit into his concept of what world building has to be. And so, yeah, I don't like Sanderson's world building. However, if you like his world building, that's fine. If you don't want to hear my criticisms of his world building, that's also fine. No one is forcing you to watch this video. I am saying this right now, by the way, because I know Sanderson has a lot of, like, very hardcore fans. So, yeah. If you do intend to stay and then disagree with what I have to say, that's also fine. If you want to share that in the comments, please just stay respectful or whatever. And yeah, if you're just interested in hearing what I have to say, you're welcome, and here are my thoughts. But before I get into my specific thoughts, because world building is so subjective, maybe just very quickly, what do I like when it comes to world building? What I like when it comes to world building is, first of all, dependent on the story. But when we're talking about the type of heroic, epic fantasy that this story is, what I like is typically a hard world building system. Not in terms of the magic, but in terms of the society. I like it when things make sense, when I see the reason why there's certain elements within the story, even if those reasons aren't specifically stated within the story, but when I can kind of, you know, understand them. I personally, in terms of magic systems, prefer softer magic systems, and in world building generally, I don't necessarily love magic focused world building. I prefer it if the magic is all part of a bigger whole, which is why I prefer softer magic systems, because somehow those authors understand that more clearly, to be honest. that magic is also part of society, etc. And also, just so that I don't get too long in here, I have made a video before talking about the series that have elements in world building that I really appreciate. I will leave that video linked down below as well, just so you have a little context of where I am coming from. Now, I think, like, there's two things that really annoy me when it comes to Sanderson fans. One is Sanderson fans praising Sanderson for his queer rap, which somehow happens a lot. He does not have a lot of great queer rap. And even the little that he has, like, I think is debatable if it's that great, actually. But we're not here to talk about Sanderson and queerness. The other thing that I find really annoying is when his fans act like just because he has the Cosmere and has this huge extensive universe, that automatically means that Sanderson is a great world builder. Which doesn't mean that, first of all, and second of all, I have an issue with the Cosmere as a whole generally. It's the same issue that I also have with the MCU and other things. It just, for me, world building that relies on you having read every single thing or having seen every single thing set in that world isn't good world building. It's not accessible, not that fantasy has to be overly accessible, but it's just, it's a needless high, you know, obstacle into getting into something. And then additionally to that, with Sanderson, one of the big problems is that he loves to share details and infos in different interviews, in Reddit AMAs, in like signings and whatever. And of course he says those things that he says aren't canonic. But this collective of statements of Sanderson that are now known as Word of Sanderson, or Word of Brennan, I think. By now we have more info on his world building from those things than from his actual books. Which, the Stormlight alone are, I think, almost 5,000 pages. So that's like pretty impressive that you have more stuff from interviews than from your actual books. And if understanding your books is reliant on your fans following your interviews, etc., I'm sorry, that's not good world building anymore. So I already have an issue with the way Sanderson shares his world building, which when he does share a lot of the stuff in his writing, especially when it comes to magic systems, I do agree that actually the way he does exposition is, for me personally, very well done. Like when you look at the prologue, or the second prologue, I guess, in The Way of Kings, when binding, or search binding, what was it called? Lashing, that's what it was. When lashings are for the first time explained. He manages to explain his magic very quickly, very concisely, and you easily get a visual of what this magic is supposed to look like. Same thing also with Elemency in the Mistborn series, in the first Mistborn series. It's just very quick, very concise, so Sanderson can do a lot when it comes to magic world building. I personally don't prefer his magic world building system, but that's because I have a preference for soft magic systems over hard magic systems. And I do think that in terms of how his magic works over the time with the additions to the Cosmere, it has sometimes become kind of convoluted and over the top. And also, it's usually not properly embedded in the society that the whole thing is set in. And that's what really brings me to my big issue. He has this like truly thought out system when it comes to his magic and when it comes to his magic world building. However, he does not keep to the same standards when it comes to the rest of his world building. And that's really it. Like, he seems to not keep one standard when it comes to all of his world building, and that makes a lot of his world building seem really disjointed. And he just is terrible at societal and also historical world building. Part of the reason is because he seemingly can't get out of his own head, and a lot of his world building is very influenced by his Mormon upbringing and him being a kind of prude, pious person, which sounds bad, to be honest. I don't have anything against that. I mean, I do have something against it when you're part of a church that's like actively working against queer people, but you know, whatever, we're not here to talk about that. So editing Sarah, and you will probably see my face a lot in this video because I should have taken notes. Let's be honest, there's a lot of things I have to say. In this regard, right now, I neglected to say that I don't have anything against authors who use a lot of their own influences within their world building. Like, even religious authors. I don't care if Sanderson uses Mormon influences within his world building. I think it, to a certain extent, can be very interesting. However, it gets really, really boring and dull when that's the main influence in literally every single one of your books. And the place where that's the most obvious, really, how singular his influences are, is when he's talking about the main religions within his series, which are very clearly monotheistic, one god, and polytheism is usually within all of his worlds, or almost all of his worlds, looked down upon. And if it's not looked down upon, as in Warbreaker, for example, the like religious system is, what's it called, like, is shown to be like the idolation of false idols, like the worship of false idols. So yeah, don't have anything against authors using their own experiences to flavor the world building. However, when you write something as huge as the Cosmere, then please just, you know, look for influences somewhere else as well. I don't know, how hard can it be? And if it's too hard for you, then don't write something like the Cosmere. It just shows in things with his world building whenever there's queer people, like genderqueer people, those people are usually not human. Like, there's, I think, a single trans character in the Stonebelt Archive. Aside from that, if there's anyone who's non-binary, those people are usually an alien or a non-human race. Then, with those aliens and non-human races, a lot of times they still have very humanoid features, even though that's like completely unnecessary. With, for example, the singers on Roshar, for some reason, female singers have boobs, even though they don't, like, what's it called, breastfeed their young or their children. And apparently there was a statement once from Sanderson that was like, it's because he likes boobs, which, fine. However, that works in a different, you know, series setting, whatever, where you don't have so much attention to detail with magic system. However, everything else in terms of the world building, it's like, it's fun. And I am completely for, haha, it's fun world building. Like, sometimes that can be amazing, and especially when it comes to magic systems, I actually really like that. However, again, there's this disjointedness where in one aspect you just poured a lot of detail into it, and in another aspect it just isn't there. And I think, I don't know, but like every now and again you see these threads or illustrations on world building in general where it's like world building kind of needs to be like an iceberg, you know? You don't see most of the world building that an author will do. And everything that's under the water, it's not always necessary that the author knows everything that's down there. It's just that the reader has to feel like that's down there. And with Sanderson, that's just really, really not the case. With Sanderson, as soon as you start thinking about stuff for 1 second, you realize that he hasn't necessarily thought of why a certain thing is that way. And I'll compare Sanderson right now in a kind of mean way to my currently favorite world builders, which are M.A. Carrick. So Marie Brennan and Alice Helms, which the two of them have created the the Rook and Rose series. And that series is a series of incredibly intricate detail in terms of the social norms and world building. There was so much attention to detail put into every single element. They have thought about, okay, what would the meteorological backgrounds be? So what would those people eat? What is the historical context of the different groups within this city that the story is set in? So how do the different foods change from each other? Who would wear what? There's like a big thing with gloves in the series where the nobles always wear gloves, which isn't dissimilar to the safe hand within Brandon Sanderson. However, the things that M.A. Carrick do with the gloves are like so much more embedded in the story than the safe hand ever is within the Stormlight archive. Okay, so back again. By the way, the way I will splice this in will sometimes, you probably already noticed, be very disjointed. But examples that I want to put here where Brandon Sanderson just fails completely at like providing the illusion of the iceberg is, for example, in the Mistborn with like all the all the religions that Seth collects, where I saw a TikTok recently, I forgot who it's by, and like no hate to the creator, that was like praising Brandon Sanderson, like wow, he created so many religions for the Mistborn. He like provided one sentence explanations for most religions. We never get to see those people, however, and like I don't get the feeling that those people even exist in the world, because the world, at least in the first Mistborn series, seems so incredibly small. The same also on Roshar. Yes, on Roshar we do get to see people from other cultures more than within like the Mistborn series. However, we still are given the bare minimum of everything. It's still very clear that Vorinism is the main religion, which, you know, has to be or something, I guess. And even within Vorinism, we get very, very little on how the different factions within Vorinism with the different countries work. When we look at Alethkar, this is a country that has only recently, in fact within the last lifespan of the people currently between 50 and 60 years old, not even that, like within the last 20 years or so, has been united. And we never get to see, aside from that it's difficult politically, we never really get to see how that influences, how like coming from the different princedoms, how that influences, for example, how the soldiers see themselves. Do the people fighting for Alethkar, do they see each, like themselves primarily as coming from Alethkar, primarily as Vorin, primarily as coming from a specific kingdom, princedom? Like, you don't get to see any of that. And that is where I'm like, Sanderson, you fail so hard at providing the illusion that your world is bigger than it actually is, or that you have thought even just a smidge of anything. And I think also that's part of where the Cosmere is really a problem for Sanderson, because I think he has admitted in interviews before that he really needs the people behind him and his assistants to help him keep track of all his world building, because obviously he has written a ton of books that supposedly are connected. So even if the world building is at a kind of like really bare bones level, because there's so many books, there's obviously a lot more content, and Sanderson can't keep track of it, and that's like why he's such a bad world builder. Anyway, I'm moving on now to the clothes again, with M.A. Carrick. You have the sewer systems, you have the weather, you have everything. You have that even for like countries and cities that aren't part of the setting, but where people come from those places, and so those things influence them. And even they haven't thought of everything, because they have a kind of like tarot type system in their world, which is called a pattern, and they're currently creating this pattern for a Kickstarter, or the deck for a Kickstarter, which I am a part of, and so I get regular updates. And so in the most recent update, they talked about how one of the cards is called something with crowns. I think it was the Face of Crowns or something. And when they were thinking of designing this pattern, they realized that no one in the city really wears crowns as the story goes on. So they had to kind of retroactively think of, okay, so why would this culture have a card that has something with crowns in the names? Where do the crowns come from? So that's what I mean with, like, obviously there's gonna be details that will not necessarily be part of the story or part of the world building. However, you still need to feel like that's there as a person. And with Sanderson, it never feels like that. Like, I have started the second book, and I am now at the point where, or a bit past the point where Jasna and Shalan talk about, you know, like the desolations and history and stuff. And we are never really told where the information on the history of Roshar comes from that the current time Alethi have. And especially with the world setting that's there, with the high storms and everything, where, okay, you do have Krem, but that also gets washed away regularly. And it's like, okay, so where does the info come from that you have historically? Do you have like weapons that you found? Do you have architecture that you found? Do you have pottery that you found? Do you have writings that you found? Which might be very unlikely, because pretty much every time there was a desolation, humanity was pushed back to prehistoric levels. Which, when you talk about prehistoric stuff, prehistory in terms of like how we understand it and how the reader would understand it, because obviously the connection would be our world. Stuff that is prehistoric, when we talk about stuff that's prehistoric, we talk about stuff that is like before writing or before writing systems. So, you know, they have writing systems after desolations, the humans. How did that look? There's so many questions that are never answered. Also with what they eat. A lot of times, you know, okay, like Sanderson just made it so that there's chicken, for example, and a lot of meat that we will be familiar with by, you know, hand waving it away with the history of Roshar. I won't go into that because that's too specific spoilers in case you haven't read up to book 3 yet, the end of book 3. So fine, but like, what types of foods do they eat? What, like, plants do they eat? They do have grains. A lot of the grains are soul cast, but soul cast food apparently tastes worse than food that is grown. However, how do they grow food? How do the grains look? Like, there's so many elements there. They eat a lot of curries, and there's a difference between men and women how spicy they eat food. Why do they eat curries, aside from like, ooh, okay, non-Western food, I want this world to have non-Western aspects, which, to be honest, don't come through a lot, actually. Those non-Western aspects pretty much are like surface level. However, in terms of how this society interacts with each other, it's still very Western coded. Like, it's very Christian Western coded. Like, not gonna lie. Anyway, like little things like those. Also, and that's, I think, is the biggest thing I have with how Sanderson interacts with world building and how little thought he puts into it. Okay, so I'm gonna have the example of the gloves versus the safe hand. Within Rook and Rose, nobles wear gloves. It is seen as indecent to not have gloves in each other's presence. There are, first of all, multiple scenes where the gloves play an important plot role, which doesn't really happen that much with Safe Hand, to be honest. However, at the same time, there's also things like, for example, playing cards. Playing cards, because the cards are so slippery, is hard with gloves on. So even nobles, when they play cards with each other, they will take off their gloves, which is why playing cards with each other is like this almost seedy, kind of undecent thing to do with each other. And like, that's how I want world building to be. With the Safe Hands, they first of all make no sense. And second of all, you have, additionally to the Safe Hands, you have the feminine arts within the Stormlight Archive. So it's very strictly gender separated what you're allowed to do as a woman, or what you're supposed to do as a woman, and what you're supposed to do as a man. However, for some reason, playing music is part of the feminine arts, where it's said that like stuff that you can do with one hand is part of the feminine arts, stuff that you do with both hands is part of, you know, the men's domain. And we all know how easy it is to play instruments with one hand, right? Like even drums, it's just so easy. And stuff like that just shows that Sanderson just puts no thought into his world building and just does what he thinks is cool, which works for some books. Like, it's not that I'm against that completely, but it doesn't work for this type of series, and it doesn't work when you put like a huge amount of detail into part of the world building while not putting any detail into other parts of the world building and just doing whatever. There's so many examples like that, where as soon as you scratch the surface a little bit, because he has a lot of detail in this, like, he has a lot of detail in a series. You can't not have detail when you have a series like this. However, it's not details that make sense in context with each other. It's just random stuff, and there's just so many things. I would give you examples, however, as I said, I didn't put down notes, so I don't have that many examples right now. Other info also, because I did just continue reading Words of Radiance, and there was this scene where Kaladin is like, an ardent woman comes towards him. He knows he's not supposed to think of ardents as men or women, but he does it anyway. And that just shows that, once again, back to the example, that Sanderson, like, even if he tries, has an incredibly hard time fitting anything into his worlds that is outside of his worldview in a way where it's not like culturally outside of his worldview, without being extremely judgmental about it, at least. And also, he's incredibly bad at doing cultural world building for the readers. Like, okay, in a lot of fantasy stories, you will have the bumbling idiot type main character that maybe comes from outside a culture or outside a magic system, is like a country bumpkin, whatever. And the reason why those tropes are so popular is because if you have that type of character, it's extremely easy to explain cultural, magical, whatever stuff to that character, and through that character also to the reader. However, Kaladin comes from this tradition. Kaladin, first of all, should not be thinking of ardents as male or female, as he says so himself in the book, but it also shouldn't be supposed to be used as a way to explain that to the reader, which, by the way, we get this sentence, but then within narrative, at least on the reread, and also not as far as I remember from the previous books, ardents are never treated as genderless. I will have a whole section on ardents in my Gender in the Stormlight Archive video, but like, Kaladin has grown up within the Vorin religion. Like, he doesn't have faith. He doesn't have a lot of faith, at least. He is somewhere in between an atheist and non-practicing. However, he has still grown up within the Vorin religion, so he should think of ardents as genderless. And, you know, if you can, like, if it was in the hands of a more competent and more interesting writer, you might then also continue on with that and be like, okay, what does agender mean within this society specifically? But yeah, it's terrible, and it just shows how little Sanderson cares, about a lot of his world building. And also, I'm just gonna put this here, I wanted to put this at the end, but like, similarly also with words. Sanderson every now and again tries to introduce words for certain concepts within his books, but then after he explains them once, he refuses to use them ever again. He has that, for example, with Navani, with Dalinar and Adolin and Renarin calling Navani, I think, Mahal or something. So having this very specific term of endearment for a somewhat related female figure. Similar terms do never appear anywhere else in the Stormlight. It also doesn't make sense. I talked about that within the live show that I did with Scylla and Steph. It also doesn't make sense in terms of Adolin and Dalinar using the same term, because usually these terms are like, either you have the same terms within one generation, but between generations you often have different ones. So, you know, it doesn't really make sense generally, but it's also just careless, to be honest. It's just there to be there. And then the last thing is that Sanderson doesn't know often what words mean and carelessly uses words that aren't supposed to be somewhere. And the example that I have that might seem minor to a lot of other people is anthropological. Jasna talks about the singers once and talks about how interesting they are in an anthropological sense. What Sanderson really wants to say is how interesting they are in an ethnological or ethnographical sense. Ethnos being the people, or a people. Anthropological, anthropos, being human. Singers are not human. Anthropological does not apply to singers. Like, I'm sorry. Words mean things. Sanderson as an author should know that. And similarly also it's a gender thing. It's with the Reshi King, where Rhysand exclaims that the Reshi King is a woman, and the king's son says gender is meaningless for the king because the king is a title. The Reshi King, however, is trans. He is a trans man. Gender very much means something for the king. What Sanderson meant to say was sex is meaningless for being a king. The Reshi King is not seen as a woman within Reshi society. So obviously gender isn't meaningless. And it's like, my guy, words mean things. You can't just use random words in your books because there's too many words anyway, and so you hope no one will notice. Like, what the fuck? And then the other thing is also, I already talked about Word of Brandon earlier, where I was like, I don't like that in terms of, you know, what you have to do. But also, it's like, he's not the only author that puts out additional information on the world building, because you can never add everything in terms of world building just within a book, right? However, like, I think that you can do those things after you publish the series, or with the stuff that you know will never come to play and won't ever be important for the plot. Like, okay, George R. R. Martin also did a whole, you know, history of the Targaryens and whatever, but you don't need that stuff to understand a Game of Thrones. Maybe you will understand it a little bit better, but you don't need all of that stuff. With Emmy Carrick, I'm actually in their Discord server, and they do share a lot of tidbits and infos on their world building. However, those are just fun things, fun additional things for readers to know. With Sanderson, like, at this point when you go to his wikis, and on most entrances, when you look at the, like, links and sources. There will be more sources referring to Word of Brennan than there will be to the actual books. And that is a problem. Because Sanderson, for some reason, also then in the spur of the moment, and that's what it feels like with a lot of the stuff. On the other hand, like a lot of the stuff in these books also feels very spur of the moment. It feels like he just said that spur of the moment because he has trouble saying to fans, hey, I don't know, I haven't thought about those things. He seemingly needs to have an answer to everything. And that is an issue when the fans then take those things and put it onto the wiki, and it kind of snowballs into things where it's then important for the books. He's a bad world builder, okay? He's a bad world builder, and I'm noticing that my space is slowly running out on my SD card. So yeah, this was just a little rant, and why I don't think Brandon Sanderson is a world builder. If his world building works for you because you don't like to dig deeper into the histories and social like implications of what's being said in the books, that is completely fine. However, don't act like his world building past the magic system of his first few books is so overly intricate and like complex and whatever, because it is not. It is just purely not. Also, I left a lot of stuff out, especially when it comes to the world building, to the gender aspect of the Stormlight Archive, because yeah, I will talk about that later. Also, by the way, that's another thing. He puts in a lot of world building that he thinks is unproblematic, but in terms of the further implications of what that means for certain races and certain people and like everything, it's actually kind of really problematic. Like the whole light eyes, dark eyes thing, it's not that great. Everything with the Scar in the Mistborn series, just, I hate it so much. Yeah, so that's another thing in his world building. He does not get what type of implications his world building has in terms of what he says about the different races and stuff, and how he's using a lot of very colonial rhetoric in his world building. And I'm not talking about characters that are colonialist or whatever, I'm talking about the world building specifically. So yeah, but we'll talk more about that in the colonialism and Stormlight Archive video. But yeah, so tell me in the comments down below, do you agree with me that Brandon Sanderson is actually just shit at world building? I know this was a very rambly video, but I told you at the very beginning. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries will be left linked down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!